Please find your seats. We're starting the second panel. Yep. Please find your seats. Thank you. That's me? Again? Please find your seats. The second panel is about to begin. Thank you. Please find your seats. We were about to begin.
Okay, thank you all. If I can get everybody's attention, we're going to get started on our next panel. So we talked a little bit about everyone. We'll get our next panel up here. So we talked a little bit about the role of regulation in the future of blockchain. So we are going to welcome back Dominic, and he'll be joined by Ed Knight, who's the Executive Vice President and Global Chief Legal and Policy Officer of NASDAQ. We're also very honored to be joined by Catherine Hahn, who's just announced the newest general partner at A16Z Crypto, which is a $300 million venture fund. Ed, Dom, Catherine, coming up.
Where do you want me?
You always need one lawyer, don't you?
We always need one lawyer there.
Who's playing the lawyer here?
Ed's our chief regulator. He's going to play. But you are a prosecutor, right?
I was a prosecutor. Not anymore, though.
You've been reinvented. That's great. So, Catherine, why don't you just tell us a little bit about your background and kind of what you're doing now with A16 Crypto?
So my background is, as you just alluded to, I was a federal prosecutor for 12 years, and I had been a lawyer in a prior life before that, too, in private practice. I used to do murders, organized crime, gangs, cybercrime, and then somehow in 2012 got introduced into, I see your puzzled look, into cryptocurrency. I was asked for the government to shut down Bitcoin in 2012 and help prosecute Bitcoin in 2012, which I had never heard of Bitcoin back then. And I went home, and my husband quickly educated me on how that would not be possible and taught me all about it. And that set me off on a path of really discovery and getting really excited about the technology. And actually, there were a lot of people in the government, even back then, very excited as they learned about some of these technologies, very early days. So that was my background. I prosecuted some of the biggest criminal use cases involving cryptocurrency, no different than had I been prosecuting wire fraud with wires or cash with crimes with traditional fiat. So anyway, that was my background, and I left the Justice Department about a year ago. I joined the board of Coinbase and a white hat hacking company called HackerOne, and just was announced Monday with Andreessen Horowitz.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
That's great. So we do a lot with Andreessen, so it's great to see you over there. That's great. Ed, why don't you give a quick background for the audience?
Well, I've been at NASDAQ since 1999 and took the company public with you and a lot of other people, and as we split off from the National Association of Securities Dealers, and before that I was the general counsel of the U.S. Treasury Department, and did that for a number of years in the Clinton administration.
Yeah, I mean, people don't realize that NASDAQ itself was a nonprofit regulatory agency for many years and went public in 2003, so we are a far public exchange now. So let's get into the topics that we touched on earlier. And maybe, Dom, I could just start off. We talked about ISOs, and they've been a popular topic of the media and across the global recently. So let's start by making sure everybody understands exactly what an ICO is. I call ICO, but that's ICOs. I know.
So an ICO is an automated sale of tokens designed to raise money to fund the development of some kind of tokenized system. So, for example, the first big ICO raised $18 million for a system called Ethereum, which is a smart contract platform that today I forget what it's worth, but is valued in the tens of billions. And back then, we were able to buy Ether tokens for 29 cents each, if I recall correctly. And recently they peaked at $1,400 each. So they made a tremendous return for investors. And it also introduced a new business model because there's no company behind Ethereum. So the natural question is to ask, why isn't there a company backing this wonderful new service? And the answer is that the Ethereum network is valuable precisely because there isn't a company behind it. There are well-known individuals like Vitalik Buterin that, work on designing developments to the network and so on. But, you could take these individuals away, you could take the Ethereum Foundation away, and the Ethereum network will continue to run. And that's what makes it exciting. So the business model had to change, and Ethereum set up a not-for-profit foundation in Switzerland. And when they promised to create this system that would have these initial tokens at Genesis, which is when the network first starts running, they sold those promises, if you like, for funds that they used to fund R&D. And eventually, once R&D was far enough along, they said they sort of pushed it out into the world and said, right, let's launch the Ethereum network using the Ethereum protocol. And so investors were able to realize a return through the appreciation in tokens that are created by a network that has no central party running it. It's a bit like the internet. It's a tokenized network, a token-operated network. Right. And so this is a completely new way of making a profit for investors and creating a service, right? And the reason it's done this way is, imagine if the internet depended on a company, right? It wouldn't be nearly so interesting. The internet is interesting because it's an internetwork, and it doesn't depend on any individual company or organization.
Well, I think a lot of the topics around regulation in the space is, what is a security? And so maybe, Catherine, I'd like you, the two former lawyer and the current lawyer, to talk about what is security and what's not a security, because I think that's where people get kind of caught up in this conversation.
Well, everyone here probably has heard of, and I feel like I've heard the name, the Howey test, way too many times in the last year. But we all know it's a Supreme Court case from 1946 that gives basically 3 prongs that securities regulators, at least in the U.S., and let's be clear, different jurisdictions treat what is a security different ways. So right now we're just talking about the U.S., but it's basically an investment of money in a common enterprise, right, where there's an expectation of profits, and those profits come from the efforts of others. That's basically what this Supreme Court case from 1946 says. Actually, I don't know how many of you know that that case law was reaffirmed by a federal court late last night in Florida, a magistrate court, and it didn't make a ton of news. I saw there was a CoinDesk article about it. It didn't make a ton of news, I think, because it didn't contain a lot of analysis. It just merely applied the Howey test to the Carta ICO, which was this Floyd, is it Mayweather?
Oh.
Yeah. So it wasn't that groundbreaking, but it was interesting that a federal court here, we are seeing this application of law still. So that's what a security is. An ICO, I think we have to be careful because I think ICO connotates a public offering, and definitely not all ICOs are public offerings. Plenty of ICOs that have been done, number one, and plenty of ICOs that are yet to launch are actually conducted pursuant to exemptions. We talk about the Reg D exemption, which is for accredited investors. There's also an exemption that's really interesting that was passed by the Jobs Act. It's called a Reg A Plus offering. So it's kind of like a mini IPO. And so those are this is some general definitions we can talk about.
No, that's great. And Ed, maybe your perspective on
well,
what is security.
I think it's important to take a step back for this audience in particular. So we're in the epicenter of the research and development center, arguably, of the world. And you and what a lot of people do here in this region innovates and creates economic growth around the world. And it's very important and it's very unique. Why does it happen here? There are three elements that economists focus on driving this sort of innovation. One is great research universities, like Stanford University, like Berkeley. Two is entrepreneurship, which is a product of our culture and very unique, and we don't find it all over the world. We find it in certain places in the Nordics. We find it in Israel, where the entrepreneurial risk-taking culture takes hold. But the third is well-functioning capital markets. That's what NASDAQ is, and we're very proud of what we've built. But what is a well-functioning capital market? It's a lot of things, but at its core is the rule of law. And in this country, the rule of law means many things. But in the capital markets, it means that when you have an investment contract, when you sell a security, you have expected to receive certain protections under federal law. And that includes registration of those securities and that you tell the truth about those securities. And if you don't, you're subject to civil and criminal penalties. And that foundation means that investors can have confidence. And if you work outside that foundation, you're going to get in trouble. That creates the liquidity and the confidence we need to raise capital, to fund these great ideas that comes from this collaboration between entrepreneurs and research universities that makes this country very unique. But we can't get away from this, and we have to abide by these securities laws. The principles were laid down in a lot of different cases and statutes, but they've held up quite well. And we find when we get away from them, what happens? There are bad people everywhere. It doesn't mean that the products that you're creating are bad or that you're bad, but there are bad people. And they will take advantage of markets that are not regulated. And we see it time and time and again. So let me give you one example in Europe, a market that NASDAQ was very involved in, that was doing good, carbon credit market. It was established by the European governments to create a better environment in Europe. And we participated in that market and traded those credits and created a market for it. But the law hadn't caught up to it. They didn't have laws requiring the registration of the exchanges that were trading it. They didn't have laws regulating where those carbon credits were deposited. And even though the law was very well intentioned and those carbon credits were doing good, what happened? Bad people came in, the market was manipulated, the depositories were broken into, and that's what happens when the law has not evolved to catch up with the innovation. And I think this is a situation where we're facing with many of these new products we're talking about here. The law hasn't caught up to them. We do not have a Reg D. We don't have a Reg Crypto. And the SEC is struggling with that. And our regulators are smart, and the Justice Department is smart, but frankly, they are not great